Hi, everyone. Wait, who am I? Justin. Okay, please stop shooting me. Thank you. Far too many bullets on this stage. All right. Man, I'm happy to be here with you guys. If we have not met, my name is Scott. Man, it's going to be a fun night. We got a lot of stuff to talk about tonight, though. So, if you were here last week, or if you were not here last week, that's okay. I'm going to catch you up on where we have been. But last week, we started talking about this idea of input. And what we call inputs are the different inputs that you and I receive every single day. And some of those inputs we love. We love some of these inputs. Maybe it's our favorite band, our favorite TV show, our best friend, or our favorite YouTuber or streamer. For others of these inputs, there's inputs that we don't really like. Let's be real for a minute, all right? Some we're not crazy about. Maybe it's that coach that always seems to single us out. Or that teacher that we're convinced actually hates our guts. Like, we've all had one of those teachers, right? We're like, I'm pretty sure a lot of my teachers hated me. Understandably, you know what I mean? Or maybe it's that parent that you just can't seem to ever please. But all of these inputs, whether they're good or bad, whether you love them or hate them, they have an effect on us. And last week we talked about how these inputs grow certain desires within us, both good and bad inside of us. We looked at Galatians chapter 6, and it talked about the fleshly desires and the spiritual desires. The fleshly desire is basically our sinful nature, the things that we know we probably shouldn't be doing, but we desire to do it anyways. And that is battling against our spiritual desire. Basically, the desire that God wants us, the thing that God wants us to actually do every single day. And what we talked about is whatever we consume, whatever we fill our hearts and our mind with, that is what we become. We talked about this idea that we reap what we sow. What you plant, you will harvest. And all these inputs have an effect on the person of who we are, who we're becoming, and they have an effect on the state of our mental health. And a large portion of these inputs, let's be real for a minute, I hope you guys are going to be honest with yourselves, honest with your small group leaders. A large portion of these inputs are actually negative influences. They're negatively affecting our mental health. They're taking a toll on our minds. And those inputs, they can be difficult to manage, right? Because ultimately they affect how we feel about ourselves. They affect how we feel about other people, and they affect how we see the world around us. And that can be kind of difficult to manage at times, right? Maybe these inputs cause our anxiety to rise, or they cause our depression to creep into our brains just a little bit more. And it's hard because what do we do when all these inputs just become too much? We've all had that moment, right, where we're just done with everything. We're done with all this stuff going on around us. We're done with our parents telling us what to do. We're done with our coach yelling at us. We're done with our friends not having our back. We're done with all these inputs, and we just want to get away from it all. And for a lot of us, when that happens, we tend to isolate ourselves, right? We tend to actually get away from the world, to get away from people, and we lock ourselves in our rooms. We put our headphones on, we turn the music up, and we just drown out the world, right? That happens to a lot of us. We want to get away from everything and everyone. I was thinking about this week, and I was trying to find the most isolated place in the world. And so I hopped on Google, and I was just trying to search from different things. And it's funny because like you kind of have a different definition of isolated place, but there's actually like been studies that have happened that talk about the most isolated place. And they have to be isolated, but they also have to be like inhabitable by humans. Like you could go to the center of the earth and not be around people. You'd also be dead, so there's that, you know what I mean? But so what they did is there's a couple people that tried to find the most isolated place in the world that's still technically inhabitable and inhabited by humans. And they found it. It's this place, go ahead and put that first picture up. It's Tristan da Cunha, which is an island. And literally, so this is a picture of the island right there. It's actually what it looks like. And then you see, that's South America right there. That's Africa right there. And right in the middle of the whole freaking Atlantic Ocean is this tiny little island. This tiny little place. It's the most isolated place on planet Earth. There's less than 300 people that live there. And why it's the most isolated place on Earth is because of how difficult it is to actually get to. You see, it's actually surrounded by water, but there's no airstrip, there's no airport, there's actually no place to actually land a plane there. So you cannot travel there by plane, you can only get there by boat. And a boat ride takes about a week or so just to get from South Africa to this island. But you think like, oh, a week, that's not bad. Like, well, the problem is boats only come to this island about 6 times a year. And so you might have to wait 2 months to actually get to this island, 2 months to actually hop on a boat, and then a week-long journey to actually make it to this island. There's less than 300 people on this entire island. Pretty much every single one of them are farmers because they have to keep feeding people because it's not like they're going to Amazon Prime their food, all right? Like, okay, so there's internet, but there's no Wi-Fi because the internet is dial-up internet. Have any of you guys actually used dial-up internet? Besides my leaders, all right? You guys have used dial-up internet? Oh man, thoughts and prayers. Oh man, it is just, dial-up internet is so slow. And they have 2 TV channels. I was trying to figure out like what TV channels they have, but I could not find it. I'm expecting it to be like the Hallmark Channel all year round, you know what I mean? It's like Christmas movies again, hope you like it. Like, I don't know what it is, but like, it is the most remote and isolated place on the earth. And it's a pretty beautiful place, to be honest. Like, oh, that sounds pretty sweet. But sometimes, when stuff starts happening around us, we kind of wish we were there, right? We kind of wish we were just like isolated from the whole world. We want to get away from the world. We want to get away from everyone around us. We want to get away from everything going on. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about isolation. And it's kind of a heavier topic. I'm not going to lie to you guys. Like, there's nothing, I'll try to make it a little approachable. I'll try to make it a little fun, but like, let's be real for a minute. Isolation is kind of a heavy topic to talk about. And so I need you guys kind of dialed in right now. I need you to kind of, you know, if you're sitting next to a neighbor that's just talking nonstop, like, I want you to dial in because I think that this message actually has application for every single person in this room. And I'll explain why in just a little bit. But you see, isolation happens when we just want to get away from everything going on. When all those inputs become too loud, when the stuff around us becomes too much, when we want to retreat from the world and retreat from people. And sometimes, in small doses, isolation can actually be good for us. It can be healthy, even. Sometimes we just need to get away from the world, right? We need to pull away from some people, we need to gather our thoughts, we need to kind of gather ourselves, and it'll be all right. Actually, about once a year, I take a vacation by myself. It's actually really, really healthy for me. It gets me in a good state. And so I will actually go to the coast for usually about 3 or 4 days. And my wife won't go with me. My daughter won't go with me. I won't go with friends or anything like that. I'm just completely by myself. And what I do is, I'm actually a person that kind of loves isolation. What I do is I try to talk as little as possible. Like, I'm kind of crazy about it. Like, I will literally like order food online so I don't have to like, call someone and like talk. Even though it's not that I'm scared to talk. I want to be as quiet as possible. I want to be, over those 3 or 4 days, I want to be as silent as possible. And it allows me to regather myself. It allows me to kind of recenter myself. It allows me to just listen to what God is going on, what God's trying to tell me, what's going on in my life. It allows me to just kind of be still. And small doses of isolation can be really, really healthy. But let's be real for a minute. Some of us in this room have made a habit out of retreating from the world, isolating from the world far too often. When our depression gets bad, when our anxiety gets too much, we isolate. And before we move on, I want to quickly just define a couple terms for you guys. And maybe you've heard me use a couple of these terms. Maybe you heard Keaton use those couple terms. Maybe you've heard them in conversations before. But I want to just define some terms for you guys before we kind of move on with this message, and also before we kind of talk next week as well. And these terms, maybe they just get thrown around, and some of them are like, I kind of know what that means, but I don't really know what that means. And I want to just clarify a couple things. So I'm going to give you 2 terms that maybe you've heard a lot before, and then a third term that maybe some of you have heard, maybe some of you haven't. The first term I want to use is anxiety. And here's how anxiety is defined. This is just my definition. This is not like some doctor's definition. This is mine. Try to be as kind of basic as possible. Anxiety is the consistent feeling of nervousness and fear. And here's the key word I want you to see in this. Consistent. Consistent feeling of nervousness or fear. And I say consistent because we all feel anxious sometimes, right? Like that's just a part of being a person, of being a human. Like we feel anxious when we have a test coming up in a subject that we're not super comfortable with, right? We feel anxious when we have a big game coming up, and if we win, we go to the playoffs, and if we lose, we go home. Or like the ultimate example of anxiousness is when your mom asks you to put the chicken out when you get home from the freezer, and then you get home and you forget, and then a couple hours later you hear the garage door go up, and you're like, I'm gonna die right now. My mother is going to kill me because of 5 pounds of chicken. You know what I mean? Like, we all get anxious, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. When I say anxiety, I'm not talking about you're nervous for a test or you're nervous because of some frozen chicken, okay? Anxiety, this is what I'm talking about, is a consistent feeling. It feels like it never goes away. We consistently feel nervous. We consistently feel fearful. Even if there's nothing to be nervous about. You have nothing to be nervous about, but you just feel nervous. That's what I'm talking about with anxiety. Because all of us can say, yeah, of course, I've been anxious before in my life. But it might not get to the point of anxiety. And I'll explain why I kind of define that a little differently in just a minute. The next one, depression. Depression is the consistent feeling of sadness, negative thoughts, and emotion. Once again, the key word, consistent. We've all felt sad before, right? Like that's just part of who we are. That's part of being human. Maybe it's something big that happened. Maybe it was a family member that passed away. You just felt sad in that moment. Maybe it was something smaller, but kind of still big to you. You got left out of your friend group, and you're just like, oh man, that doesn't really make me feel good. We've all felt that before. We've all had negative thoughts before, right? When we beat ourselves up, we bombed the test, we didn't make the team, we just get down on ourselves. But when it gets to that point of depression, that's that consistent feeling. It consistently feels like that. And it's not based on your situation. It's not based on the things that are going on in your life. The example of like, oh, a family member passed away, therefore I feel sad. That makes sense. You're going to feel sad in that moment based on your situation. But sometimes when depression truly hits, life might be going great, and you still feel sad. You still have those negative emotions, those negative thoughts. It's not just a season that you're going through. It's not just a phase you're going through. It's something that you're feeling every single day, and depression can happen for weeks or months or years. Last one, maybe you've heard this term, maybe you haven't heard this term before. It's called a mood disorder. And a mood disorder is basically, it's not just like one disorder, it's actually for a lot of different things. And a mood disorder is your mood and your emotions are distorted because of a mental illness. So things like, there's a mental illness called major depression. It's literally what it sounds like. It's depression, but like 10 times worse, okay? Or bipolar disorder. Basically, you can have you can swing back and forth between different emotions very quickly, very radically. And what this is basically like sometimes it affects your everyday life. And some of you guys are sitting there and you're like, bro, what the heck are you talking about? And others of you are sitting there and you're like, yeah, I think I have that. Let's be real. Like, I'm not telling you to self-diagnose right now, all right? Like, that's not for me to do, that's not for you to do. But some of you guys are like, oh yeah, I constantly feel nervous. I constantly feel fearful. I'm constantly sad. It doesn't matter what's going on in my life. And I say all that, I define all those things to say this. I want to define those things because I'm going to be honest with you guys right now. Like, the first one, anxiety, I don't ever really feel anxious. Like, it's definitely not to the level of anxiety. I don't really get nervous about things anymore. I really don't. It just is not in my nature. And I say all that not as like, I'm above you, like I have ascended and you all are peons, you know what I mean? Here's why I say that. But I sometimes struggle with depression just as much as someone else does. I don't know if it goes to the level where I would call it depression, but there's sometimes where I feel depressed. And I say that in that way, not to belittle people that have depression. I say that in a way that basically, here's what I want to talk to you about that. If you're sitting there and you're like, oh yeah, I struggle with depression, and I just think differently, and I change my mood, I can tell you right now, you don't struggle with depression. Like, you just don't, all right? You don't get it. And I'm just trying to be as honest as I can with you. If we could just say like, oh yeah, I feel sad sometimes, and then I just don't, you're not struggling with depression. You're just not. You don't understand it. Because people that struggle with depression, people that struggle with anxiety, they don't have control over it. They can't just wish it away. They can't just change their mindset and they're magically healed. That's not how this stuff works. So sometimes when anxiety hits, sometimes when depression hits, sometimes maybe you actually have a mood disorder, we feel like we want to isolate from the world. We want to pull away from everyone and everything. And I'm here to tell you that will not help you. And actually, it usually makes things worse. Almost every single time, if you are feeling depressed, if you are feeling anxious, and you pull away from the world for an extended period of time, that will make things worse. The writer of Proverbs, Solomon, who's one of the wisest men to ever live, said this in Proverbs 18 about isolation. He says, whoever isolates himself seeks his own desires, and this is the key part. He goes against all sound judgment. Basically, when you isolate yourself, you go against all sound judgment. What the writer is trying to tell us here is that when you isolate from other people, you don't get to use other people's wisdom. Other people's mistakes that you get to learn from. Other people's good choices that you get to learn from. You only get to learn from yourself. And if you're like me, you're kind of dumb. All right? Like, let's be real. Like, I ain't that smart. You want to know how I'm not that smart? I just use the word ain't in a sentence. That's not even a word, okay? I'm really dumb. And so when you say things like this, basically when you're isolating, you're saying, I'm going to only depend on me right now. And man, if I'm only depending on me, I'm in a world of trouble. It's really, really bad, right? Because I only get to learn for myself. You have to have those people around you, those people that can help you navigate through your depression, navigate through your anxiety. But just to be clear, you don't need to tell everyone. I'm not saying that like, oh, go through your phone and every single person, every single contact you have in there, send them a text message saying, I feel depressed today. That's going to work out real bad for you. Or create a TikTok dance about your anxiety and post that. That also seems like a really bad idea. You might get a lot of views. I'm not sure how this works, to be honest. But you don't need to tell every single person you know, hey, I'm feeling anxious today. Hey, I have anxiety today. Hey, I just got diagnosed with depression. Hey, I just got diagnosed with this mood disorder. You don't need to do that. But you need to reach out to a few people. You need to reach out to your small group leader. You need to talk to your parents about it. Talk to someone about it. And let me give a quick disclaimer. When I say talk to someone about it, if you want to talk to your best friend, awesome. Talk to your best friend about it. But don't just talk to your best friend about it, okay? Because, once again, going back to the thing I was just talking about, not to bag on your best friends, but your best friends are probably just as dumb as you are. Because my best friends were just as dumb as I was, okay? That's not a knock on you guys, that's an insult to me, okay? And so what happens is you reach out to this person and they're just as much of a train wreck as you are. And you're like, help me for advice, and they're like, what? You know what I mean? It's just no, don't do that. You know what I mean? Reach out to someone that can actually help you, that can point you back to Jesus, that can actually give you good advice. Not the moron that lives next door to you, okay? That, I'm not trying to bag on your friends, I promise, I'm not, all right? But I want you guys to reach out to those people. But for others of you, you hear me talking about isolation. You hear me talking about isolating from people, shutting the world out, never being around people for maybe a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe even a month or two. And you're sitting there and you're like, dude, what the crap are you talking about? I am constantly around people. Like, I live my life around people. I'm always around this friend. I'm always around this group of friends. I'm always DMing people. I'm always text messaging people. If it's a weekend, I'm spending the night at someone's house, or someone's spending the night at my house. I am around people all the time. You hear me talk about isolation, you're like, bro, what are you talking about? Isolation? What the heck is that? I'm surrounded by people, and I love it. And if that's you, this message applies to you as well. Because I know this about people, not just junior high, people in general. You either isolate from other people, or you isolate from your problems. Some of you guys that are around people all the time, you're around your friends all the time, you're around your team all the time, yeah, you might not be isolating from people. But some of you guys are isolating from your problems. And here's what I mean by that. When your depression hits, when your anxiety hits, when life doesn't go your way, you don't separate from other people. You separate from your problems. You try to get out of the house as much as possible because you don't want to deal with your parents. You don't want to think about your homework when your GPA is at 1.2. Reach. You don't want to worry about any of that stuff, right? And I know some of y'all are sitting there and you've got that like nervous laughter because you're like, oh crap, he's talking about you. And yes, I 100% am. But you don't want to isolate from other people. You just want to have a good time. So what you do is you surround yourself with stuff. You surround yourself with inputs. You surround yourself with people. You surround yourself with music. You surround yourself with all this extra stuff. Because when you do that, even if it's just for a moment, you don't have to think about your problems. And you don't have to deal with your problems. Even if it's just for a moment, you don't have to think about the loneliness that you feel when you're surrounded by people. You don't have to think about not fitting in when you're just playing basketball. You don't have to think about your parents splitting up when you are lost in your headphones. And for just a moment, you get to isolate and be separated from your problems. And you run away. And you don't have to think about your crippling anxiety. So you do everything you can to not think about it. But if you've done this for long enough, just like isolating from people, that doesn't help. It doesn't make your problems go away. Isolation from people, isolation from your problems will not help. God designed every single one of us to be in community. To have people around us to give us good judgment, to help us navigate through times of struggle. I do not want you guys to isolate yourself, either from your problems or from other people when your mental health isn't doing great. I want you to reach out to people. I want you to reach out to your small group leader. I don't want you to run away and isolate from your problems because that will not produce the results that you truly want. Paul says it like this when it comes to our suffering in Romans chapter 5. He says, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. Check this part out. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character. And character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. What he's saying right there is when we face our struggles, when we begin to tackle our mental health struggles, it produces perseverance, character, and hope. And for some of you guys, you are sitting there and you are struggling with anxiety. Some of you guys are sitting there and you are struggling with depression. I know, based on just pure statistics, the likelihood of a lot of you guys having a diagnosed mental illness, being on some sort of medication, there's probably a lot of you guys in this room. And I want to first off say, if that's you, you are not alone. That's not something you should feel shameful of. But I know a lot of you, if you're sitting there, and maybe you have a diagnosis, or maybe you don't. Maybe you're taking medication, or maybe you're not. You're probably sitting there and you're like, man, I know what I'm feeling right now. It's not hope. It's not hopeful when my depression hits. It's not hopeful when my anxiety hits. I feel like I'm lacking that hope. And what this verse is saying right there is when you don't isolate from people, when you don't isolate from your struggles, when you face them head on, when you say, I'm going to get serious about my mental health, I'm going to get serious about tackling this depression, I'm going to get serious about tackling this anxiety, I'm going to get serious about tackling this mood disorder, when that happens, it produces hope. It provides hope. Later in the book of Romans, Paul calls God the God of hope. Basically, he is the one that dispenses hope. He is the one that gives hope. Paul then writes in the book of Galatians, he says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. What he's saying right there is every single one of us need to carry one another's burdens. So when a friend turns to you and they're like, hey, I'm struggling with this. Man, I'm struggling with depression right now. I'm struggling with anxiety. Maybe my medication isn't quite working the way it used to. And I just feel like I'm struggling with all this stuff. At that moment, we are called by God to carry one another's burdens. You ever see that in like sports where someone turns an ankle and they can barely walk? So a couple other guys, they throw their arm around him and they just carry him. They carry him off the field. They carry him to the locker room. That's what that picture is. It's basically, I know you're struggling with depression. I know you're struggling with anxiety. Here, throw your arm around me. I got you for a little while. Let me help you out. Let me navigate through this with you. We are here to help carry your burdens, to help you walk through isolation, to help you with your depression and anxiety. But to do that, you have to live in community, not isolated from the world, not isolated from your problems, and not isolated from God. Because living in community allows us to better stand up against tough times. Because now you got people around you. Now you're not relying on yourself and only yourself. You've got people that can give you good judgment. They've got people that can encourage you and help you navigate through all the stuff. Look, I know this stuff can be really heavy and really difficult to talk about sometimes. I'm not trying to deny that by any means. And it can be really difficult being vulnerable and talking about this stuff. And talking about your small group. Yeah, I'm on medication right now. Yeah, I've been struggling with depression for a little while now. Yeah, I just feel anxious at all times. I'm fearful. I'm nervous, even when life is going great. I know that can be really difficult. But like Paul said, when we face our struggles, it eventually produces hope. If you're struggling with depression, you're struggling with anxiety, I can guarantee you need a little bit more hope in your life. And God is saying, I am the God of that hope. I can give that to you freely, without cost to you. I want you to have hope. And if you're sitting there and you are feeling like all hope is lost, and if you're in that spot, man, I'm so sorry. I never want you to feel like that. But I also want you to know that you can turn to a God of hope. And say, yes, the future might seem scary. Yes, the depression might feel heavy. But I'm here for you. And I'm here to give you hope. And the God of hope is ready to walk with you every step of the way. I'm going to pray, and we're going to go into a time of small groups. And I would ask that you might be in two camps right now. Maybe for some of this stuff, you're like, man, I don't know. I never struggled with depression anymore. I never struggled with anxiety. If that's you, maybe this small group time is just there for you to listen. Maybe you don't have to share anything. But if you haven't gone through any of that stuff before, maybe it's time to listen to the people that have. And if you're sitting there and you're like, man, you're talking about me. You're talking about my journey. Maybe it's time for you to be vulnerable in your small group.
and share what's going on. Share what's going on in your heart. Share what's going on in your mind. Share how long it's been going on. And maybe it's just time for you guys to come together. For those people that haven't struggled with it before, maybe it's time for you to throw an arm around someone and carry their burden and begin to pray for them, love them, and encourage them, and provide hope for them. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to go into this time of small groups. If you don't know where your small group is, come see me, come see Keaton over there. We'd love to direct you guys where you're going. So let's pray. God, we are so grateful that you are a God of hope. God, because that is what we need right now. Whether we deal with depression and anxiety or have a mood disorder or whether we don't, God, we can all use more hope. God, right now, I lift up every single small group. I lift up every single small group leader, that you would give them the words to say and the time to listen. God, I pray for a spirit of vulnerability. For those students that are worried about sharing what's going on in their life, I pray that you would give them a spirit of boldness, that they can share what's going on so that they can begin to have hope. Because God, when we face our struggles head on, when we don't isolate from the world, isolate from our problems, God, it produces perseverance, character, and hope. God, we need more hope. God, we love you, and we thank you for your sacrifice. Amen.
Hey, head off to small groups, and we will see you guys.
Yes, and if you are in Presley and Denise's small group, come find me up here because I will be taking you to your new small group location. If you are in Presley and Denise's small group, everyone else is in the same spot.